Welcome to the Museum of Everything podcast. We're Dan and Josh, the curators of the Museum of Everything. We're here today to discuss what to see in the Met Museum of Art. But first, we're going to begin, as always, with some Museum of Everything pub trivia. So, Josh, what's your first question to me?
What phrase did Homer use to describe the color of the Aegean in the Iliad and the Odyssey?
I believe he called it the wine-dark sea.
That is correct. Good work.
All right, so that's one to me. Do you want to gloss that at all?
Well, there's some debate as to when ancient societies began having separate words for blue. Virtually every language had a word for every other color before it finally got the word blue. And there's some debate as to whether or not Homeric-era Greece had a word for blue, but in fact, I think this is rather silly, and Homer was just being poetic, as he was in so
It's an
many
extremely
ways.
evocative description, isn't it? The wine-dark sea. You can really picture that.
Yeah, and when he talks about rosy-fingered dawn, it's not like, oh, you didn't have a word for orange, the rising sun, or something like that.
Absolutely.
Or pink. It's Homer was a very good poet, and there's a reason he's lasted so long. So I think the idea that he called the ocean wine dark because he didn't have a word for blue is just absurd.
All right, well, that's one question to me. My first question to you is, name every man to have walked on the moon.
Okay, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Pete Conrad, Al Bean, Al Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, Dave Scott, Jim Irwin, John Young, Charlie Duke, Gene Cernan, and Harrison Jack Schmidt.
That is correct, and I didn't say that you had to list them in order, but you did. So you probably could get bonus
how I
points
had
for
them in
that.
my mind.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Who's going to be the
question.
next man to walk on the moon?
When will we go back, and who will that be?
It's presumably going to be in the relatively near future, one would hope.
I hope it's me. I'm available.
You are available. You volunteered. I wouldn't do anything less than. Well, actually, no. I would go to the moon. I would 100% go to the moon if anyone offered me the chance to do that. We're here, just so you know. All right. So that's one for each of us. What's your second question to me?
Where is Old Zealand? That is as opposed to New Zealand.
Yeah. Well, if New Zealand was discovered by someone English, then it must be in England. But that, wait, no, but Zealand doesn't sound like a very English name.
Nor were New Zealand and Australia discovered by an Englishman. You know that Australia was...
It was discovered by Abel Tasman. That was Tasmania.
He discovered Tasmania, and he discovered New Zealand. I think he missed Australia famously.
Was Abel Tasman not English? I always assumed that he was.
No, I don't think so. What did Australia used to be called?
I didn't know it used to be called anything.
Well, I can't tell you. It'll give you the answer to the question.
I don't know. Holland.
Can't you deduce? Yeah, Holland is correct. It used to be called New Holland, and Old Zealand. I mean, Zealand is still a province in the Netherlands. It's the most southwesterly province.
I didn't know that, but Zealand does sound like a Dutch name, so there you are.
All right, I'll give that to you.
My second question to you is, where is the poet W.B. Yeats buried? You can name either the nearby mountain or the churchyard in which he is entombed.
A nearby mountain.
Yes.
Is it Montmartre?
No.
I mean, that's the only mountain I can think of he might be buried
Yeats,
in.
the great Irish poet, is buried in Ireland, and I'm not telling you the answer. I'm just telling you what country he's in. But he tells you in one of his...
Ireland.
Yes, there are. He tells you in one of his last poems where he wants to be buried, and he even gives the epitaph that he wishes to have carved on his tombstone in a great poem, whose name I cannot give you because it would also give away the answer to this question.
I mean, is it Tintern Abbey?
No, if you don't know the poem, you're just not going to get it. But I'm rather shocked, I have to say.
All right, well, tell me.
The name of the poem is Ben Bulben. And under Bear Ben Bulben's head in Drumcliff churchyard, Yeats is laid. An ancestor was rector there long years ago. A church stands near. By the road an ancient cross, no marble, no conventional phrase. On limestone quarried near the spot by his command these words are cut. Cast a cold eye on life, on death. Horsemen pass by. That is the end of the poem Under Bear Ben Bulben, or Under Ben Bulben, and that is exactly where he's buried. He actually died, I believe, in France, but he wanted to be disinterred and reinterred exactly where he had described, and so subsequently he was. A year later, they dug him up, they moved him to Drumcliff Churchyard, and gave him a tombstone exactly as he had described in the poem. It's one of my favorite few lines of poetry in the English language for its extraordinarily rhythmic nature. It's just a wonderful. It really rolls off the tongue, which is why I still know it. But I thought that you would have encountered this poem, though. I'm pretty sure that Dad made us both memorize it.
Nope.
Well, in any
just
event,
you, I guess.
I'm sorry you missed that. So that's I'm
I
ahead
should read
2-1
more
now. So do you want to give me another question here?
Yep. So during the Second World War, an unclassed flat-bottom schooner was used to deliver coast watchers to islands in the New Hebrides to track the movement of the Japanese fleet. What was its name? It was technically an army ship, despite being a ship.
Is this referenced in Father Goose?
No.
It sounds like it.
You're thinking along the right lines,
Wait.
but not Father Goose.
Wait. This would be... is it the Echo?
Yes, it is. Very good. The USS Echo.
This
Very,
story,
very good.
I guess so this story is told in the wackiest ship in the Army,
Yes,
which is...
I had no idea that was a true story, and I was so excited when I discovered it last night that I almost called you at like 4 a.m. to tell you. And I was like,
This is a
no,
true
I'll
story.
save this for trivia. Yeah, and a lot more of the story is true than you'd think. The captain, Jack Lemmon plays Captain Rick Crandall in the movie. I think his real name was Rip something or other. Right, I have it written down somewhere. Rip Riddle, Meredith Rip Riddle was his real name. And they did, in fact, dress up as Pacific Islanders and sail out in the open so that the Japanese would just think they were fishermen, and successfully snuck in coast watchers to lots. They did it more than 50 times, not the one time
That's
portrayed in the movie.
fascinating, and I have to say, it's a really good film. It's one that we always enjoyed, and it's an unusual role for Jack Lemmon because Jack Lemmon is usually... he's not always the manliest of characters, but he really is in this film, and he pulls it off very well. Great performance.
Yes, originally, apparently, I mean, if you can go by the IMDb page, he was going to play the young ensign role,
which was played by Ricky Nelson.
Right, yeah, and he was too old to be an ensign. I mean, he had actually been an ensign in the Navy during the Second World War, but he wasn't Ensign Pulver anymore. He was too old for that, so they decided to give him the senior officer role, and he plays it really well. I mean, it's one of my favorite Jack Lemmon performances.
Definitely, and even though I haven't seen it in a while, it's really a good film. So there's some films where we seem to have seen them many more times than we should have, given how much we like them or dislike them. And I think that bringing up Baby falls into that category of films we overwatched. This might be a film that we've underwatched because it's a really good movie, one I always enjoy.
It's available on YouTube in its entirety.
Well, I might watch it tonight then. I think, all right, so at this point I'm ahead 3 questions and you have 1. So even if you answer the last question correctly, you can't possibly win. However, I am going to propose a modification because last time I gave you an incorrect answer, which you scored as correct, because it turns out that Cary Grant is not in Dinner at 8. Now, I'm gobsmacked by this. For some reason, I had pictured him...
That explains why it wasn't on my list.
I had pictured him on the box, and yet it turns out I was wrong. So I will say, even though I'm a question ahead here, if you can answer this question correctly, we should go on to tiebreakers, I guess. I think that the point is, I think you get a bonus question from that.
So we're subtracting a point retroactively from you.
Yeah. So let's say we're going to be tied here and go into
right.
my last question, which is, who were the 4 main cast members in The Honeymooners?
Jackie Gleason, Art Carney, Joyce Randolph, and Audrey Meadows.
Very good. Very good. The Honeymooners was America's first favorite TV show, I think. Yeah. And it preempts. Unless you count a variety show
It was the first sitcom.
Yes,
The
and
first
but it comes
nationally
considerably
popular
before
sitcom, I think.
the Dick Van Dyke Show or I Love Lucy. Is the previous decade, end of the previous decade, and it created the idea of the sitcom really, and also the idea of a TV show focusing on a completely ordinary person as opposed to someone who was fancy higher up in society. Ralph Cramden, played by Jackie Gleason, is a bus driver. There's a statue of him in character outside the Port Authority bus terminal in New York City.
Is there?
Yes, there is.
I
Big
never
bronze
noticed
statue.
that.
It's really nice, actually.
It's been a while since I've been to the Port
The
Authority.
one and only good thing about the Port Authority is the statue of Jackie Gleason as Ralph Cramden.
It is a pretty hateful, awful place. Whenever I've taken buses from there, it's been
Yeah.
a nightmare.
All right.
Anyone who's lived in New York knows that, though.
Time for tiebreakers then. Do you want to give me a tie-breaking question? Do you have one?
Yep, I do. What national ethnic group did Beowulf belong to?
Well, I assume if you're asking me this, it's not an obvious thing like the Saxons, but no, they wouldn't have been there anyway. All right, I can ask you some surrounding questions, presumably.
Yeah.
What part of England is Beowulf from?
He's not from any part of England.
Okay.
The story, most of the story takes place in Denmark. That is, Hrothgar is a king of the Danes. Beowulf comes from what is now part of Sweden. But it says repeatedly that he is from a certain group of who are now Swedes.
So you don't mean where the actual poem was from, but you just mean
the man Beowulf.
The man Beowulf.
Oh, I see what the confusion is. Yeah, it's
That is, your question is concerning a character rather than the actual
right. The poem was probably written in southern England, maybe, but concerned.
But that's not what you're asking here. You're
Right.
asking where the character
The
Beowulf
character
is
of
from.
Beowulf comes from where?
I know, the Spear Danes are discussed in the first line of the poem, but he wasn't Danish.
Yeah, I didn't ask this initially because I thought it was too easy. Because you know Beowulf very well.
Yes, but I don't know where he's from. So I have to surrender this one.
He was Geatish. He was a Geat.
Where's that introduced? It's probably 150 lines in or something.
Well, I don't have a copy of the poem. Modern Gotland in Sweden.
It begins Wat win Gardena nyer dium Theod Kunninga Thrumia Frunan Hutha Athalingas Ellen Fremadon Oft Schuld Shathing Shathan Athratum Moinu Mayathum Meota Sela Ofter Esod Eorlis Sithan Ersworth Fayshift Funden Heda Strothir Bard Wexum Welcome Werth Munden Thach Otha Teme Welch Farem Satendra Ofa Ronan Rada Iron Shoulder Gombenilden. That was good Kunning. But that's only the first 10 lines or so. But I don't believe there's any mention of Beowulf until considerably later. In any event, I get that one wrong. So if you answer the next question correctly, you will win. So shall I just lay this on you then?
Yeah.
All right. Name 5 types of whales.
Okay, I can do that. Let's see. Humpbacks, sperm whales, right whales, bowhead whales, blue whales. I could go on.
You could go. All right, fine. I should have given you 10 types, but I don't know. I didn't know this was going to be a tiebreaker question. In any event, well done. You have won this round of Museum of Everything Pub Trivia. Mazel tov. So we can now move on to the main topic, which is going to be what you should see when you go to the Met Museum in New York City, which is one of the great museums in the world and one of a relatively few museums which are encyclopedic in nature. That is, they go through the entire history of art, or at least attempt to. Other than that, people say the Louvre is an encyclopedic art museum, and it almost is, but it doesn't include modern art, so it not technically. Then the Art Institute in Chicago also is, and also is one of the greatest museums in the world. But some of our very favorite museums, such as the Uffizi, are highly focused on a particular time in history and a particular style of art. The Met is a great way to get an overview of art. And in as much as we both used to live in New York, we've both been to it quite a lot. So,
yeah, and we've sort of broken this down because I am more of an ancient history type guy, and you, who were a painter for a decent portion of your life, I don't know to what extent were you professional, but
I did sell one painting.
Yeah, so that's halfway to Van Gogh. So I'm going to do more of the ancient stuff, and you're going to do more of the more recent stuff. And if you're going into the Met, you turn right and you go into Egypt.
Well, wait, I feel inclined to point out, actually, that Van Gogh only sold one painting in his life.
It's a tie.
Yes, so far, so good, I suppose. I want to dispute where we entered the Met, though, or at least give you an alternative suggestion. I don't think we should necessarily begin with Egypt. It makes much more sense to me if you begin with ancient Greece. Would you be willing to do that?
No, because ancient Egypt is much older.
Well, yes, but it's on the other side of the museum. You see, in order to tour the museum properly, this is more of a geographic question. I don't believe that you should enter the museum and turn right. You should really enter the museum and turn left.
Well, but then you can't look at the things chronologically. That's absurd.
You don't look
We're
at the
talking
things.
about ancient history. You can't start with something that's practically brand new, only 300 BC, and then go to something that's 2,000 years older.
Yes, you
That's
can.
insane.
Of course
That's
you can.
madness.
No, you don't look at the things chronologically because they are not arranged that way in any event. I mean, that's one of the charming things about the museum is that they clump things together. But you can go immediately adjacent to European painting. You'll find ancient Assyria and so forth. I mean, that's one of the charming things about the museum. So I don't think that you need to insist on chronological order. If you do, you're going to make the geographic order impossible to understand. And because people are going to be walking through the museum, presumably you can't teleport yourself from
The
Egypt
route
to
I'm
Greece.
proposing is you go through Egypt to Dendur and then go all the way back to the lobby and then through Greece.
No, you shouldn't do that. What you should do is instead you go to the left, you go through Greece, then you go upstairs through European painting, then American 20th century art, then older European painting, which again will take you upstairs, downstairs to medieval art, then through the American wing, and finally you can go through Asia, which is worth seeing, and then very end you go down to Egypt.
All right, so we're starting with Egypt.
That's just all right. Fine, start with Egypt. I just see if I care, but it's not what I would do. But okay, we're gonna go to the right. You don't have to steer people. You just tell them approximately where things are. I think it's pretty easy to find the Temple of Dendur. It's visible from the outside of the museum.
Yeah, well, but Egypt itself is arranged chronologically, and my remarks on Egypt are going to follow the chronological arrangement of this.
Well, actually, first tell us why we're even bothering. What is worth seeing about the art of ancient Egypt?
Well, the thing about ancient Egypt is how unbelievably ancient it is. So if you go into the Egypt section, you'll see a column from the Old Kingdom. And then if you've gone in the opposite direction, if you turn left from the lobby and gone into the ancient Greece section, you'll see a Greek column, which is similar in a lot of ways artistically, but it's 2,000 years newer. It's a very dramatic change. So when you look at the Greek column, I think is closer in time to us now than it is to this Egyptian column, which basically performed the same function, holding up the outside courtyard roof of a temple. And so to think about how unbelievably ancient the ancient Egyptian stuff is, it's really striking. It's more interesting for the historical context that you see it in than for the art itself. Frankly, I don't find any of the Egyptian stuff to be remarkably beautiful, not in the way I do the Greek or Roman stuff.
Well, I like that hippopotamus. Are you going to cover that as?
I wasn't going to, but I do like the hippopotamus.
The turquoise hippopotamus is extremely striking. I think it's the most attractive thing in the Egyptian wing. Although the Temple of Dendur is striking, I won't take you out of order. I will just point out, or I will ask: do you actually go to see Egyptian art first when you go to the Met?
Sometimes.
I wouldn't. Well, I mean, you could, but the point is, when you go to a museum, you arrive full of vim and vigor, and then eventually you end up worn out and you don't have enough energy to look at other things. Generally speaking, I put the most important things at the top of my list so I can see them first.
It really depends whether I'm in a history mood or an art mood, because it's both a history and an art museum.
That's a good point. And if you want to see the history aspect, then yeah, there's a lot of that in the Egypt wing. All right, take us through the Egypt wing.
Right, so I would start by we're going to move pretty quickly through this, but if you want to see something in the Old Kingdom, it's the architecture of the Old Kingdom rather than the sculptures that are particularly interesting. So look at the column and just think about the fact that the column you will eventually see in the Greek section is 2,000 years newer, which is pretty remarkable.
What's the name of this column?
It's the palm column of Sahur. It's got a very distinctive capital of palm fronds sort of departing outwards. They're sort of similar to the Temple of Dendur capitals, but it's 2,500 years older than the columns of the Temple of Dendur, because we'll get to this in a second, but the Temple of Dendur is really a Roman temple. It comes from a much, much later period in Egyptian history that really has nothing whatever to do culturally with ancient Egypt when we talk about ancient Egypt. So this column is from the Old Kingdom period. It's really hard to say exactly when it begins, and there's a lot of debate about this. But this is about 2,500 years BC, so about 4,500 years ago from now. Then you move on to the Middle Kingdom. The most interesting thing in the Middle Kingdom section is a portrait of, annoyingly, there's a lot of debate on how to spell this pharaoh's name in English. So Senusret III or Senworsret III. The Met uses the Senworset spelling, which is a little less common, but that's what they feel like doing. He's a Middle Kingdom pharaoh. He's extremely interesting. We don't know anything about him aside from the fact that, unlike virtually every other pharaoh in Egyptian history and every other pharaoh from the Middle Kingdom, his portraits actually show distinct facial features rather than idealized facial features. So there's a really remarkable statue of him in the Met that is a sphinx with his face on it. But you can tell it's his face because he has distinct facial features. And he looks rather sad and tragic in this sphinx. It's by far the most interesting thing in the Middle Kingdom gallery. And he's got very big ears that stick out. He looks a little like Bing Crosby. He's got sort of bags under his eyes. He's missing his nose, but he's got a sad face. A sort of a world-weary face, which is something that's seen in most of his later sculptures. And very interestingly, there is another statue of him in the Brooklyn Museum, which is one of the much less interesting idealized portraits of him from when he was younger, from earlier in his reign. It's a more famous statue because it's one of the few complete statues of him or of any pharaoh from this period, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. But the face is just a completely blank, unimaginative face, like all the other pharaoh sculptures. But if you look at the one in the Met, you can see the actual expression, the actual tiredness and exhaustion of a man who lived almost 4,000 years ago.
Well, why would they have bothered carving a sad and world-weary expression into a statue? And presumably they could tell him to cheer up.
The only conceivable reason was that he told the artist to carve him that way. There's no ancient Egyptian artist would have said, you know what, I feel like making the pharaoh look sad today. Maybe he'll enjoy that. So he must have had a reason, but we know nothing whatsoever about the lives of any of these people. Really, we only know about them because the Egyptians loved making lists of people's names, which will become relevant in a second. So we know who his predecessors were and his successors, and we know his face because it's really the only unique face of this period at all in history. I mean, there are no unique 4,000-year-old faces that we know of, really, aside from this guy, which is what makes it so extremely interesting. And the Met has one of the best examples of these sculptures. You can't miss it because it's also a sphinx.
I don't think I've ever spent time looking at it, so the next time I go to the Met, I guess I'll...
That's why you've got to go to the Egyptian section. Then if we move on from the Middle Kingdom, there's a sort of an interregnum. There's a break before we get to the New Kingdom, and there's really not that much interesting stuff.
What is the Old Kingdom?
Well, basically, you have Egyptian history is broken down into three main sections: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is sort of very diffuse and not very well understood. It's when the pyramids were built. And really nothing is known at all.
Does that mean biblical times or pre-biblical times?
No, biblical times are much later. Biblical times don't come until the period that I'm just coming to, sort of the interregnum and then the New Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom is dated starting at around 3,000 to 2,500 BC. So basically 5,000 years ago. Whereas the events in the Bible, the ones that have some connection to historical facts, so far as we can tell, are something in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 2,000 BC. So more than 1,000 years after this, as much as 2,000 years after this. For the oldest, I think the oldest part of the Bible generally the consensus is the Song of Deborah, which I think was written in about 1,000 BC. But then the events that are being discussed in much of the Old Testament deal with periods that were about 500 years before they were written. So we don't get to that till later, but that is connected to what I want to talk about with the intermediate period between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, because that was when Egypt was briefly run by a people called the Hyksos. We know very little about them, but in ancient literature, they were, after the Bible had been written, they were frequently connected to the Jews because there's a lot in common with the Exodus story, or the the pre-Exodus story of Joseph and the patriarchal early Jewish families, Jacob's sons, Reuben, Simon, the tribes of Israel. And so what we know about the Hyksos is that apparently studies of tooth enamel and DNA suggest that they came from northern Israel, what is now northern Israel. And they came originally perhaps as shepherds because of a famine, looking for a place to graze their sheep, and eventually became part of the highest strata of Egyptian society, and then reigned as kings for 100 years, thereabouts, or 200 years. And then were driven out of Egyptian high society and disappear from the historical records.
That sounds rather like a biblical story.
It does, yes. And there's a huge debate. I don't want to spend too much time talking about obscure theories of ancient Egyptian history because I think that's what every other podcast does, to exclusion of virtually everything else. But there are obvious big differences between this and the biblical narrative of Joseph going down to Egypt. But there are also so many parallels that you would have to think that a story being written about this period, roughly in Egyptian history 1,000 years later, must have been aware of it, or else there wouldn't be so many parallels. There's very little Hyksos stuff at the Met, but there are a few scarab seals, which you can see in the rooms in between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And they're worth looking at just because of the historical value of the Hyksos period. But we move on from the Hyksos to the most interesting, by far, in my opinion, period of Egyptian history. In the New Kingdom, the so-called Amarna heresy, this is a period that has so much in common with the biblical story that Freud wrote at great length, believing that this Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten was Moses, or that Moses was one of his priests. And you have to squint a little to make it fit with the biblical narrative, but there are so many similarities that you have to be willfully not wanting to see them, not to see the circumstantial evidence comparing it to the Exodus story. And it's very difficult because for a long time in archaeology, the trend was towards biblical maximalism, trying to fit everything in with the Bible story. And then starting in the 20th century, we went in the reverse direction. Exactly. Biblical minimalism, trying to disprove essentially any connection to the biblical story. And so
Which seems just out of sheer bloody-mindedness, incidentally, because we have this remarkable historical and religious document, and if it were not explicitly connected to the Judeo-Christian tradition, then presumably all historians would regard it as the most remarkable historical document ever to fall into our hands. But because Christianity is in such poor favor at the moment, it would seem, we have to prove everything in the Bible is false, or at least that seems to be the current trend among historiographers.
Yeah, which is unfortunate from an archaeological point of view, because it seems like people study certain periods less than they should have because they are afraid of making inevitable connections to the Bible, which they think will make them seem like less serious scientists. But aside from the fellow we just discussed, the Middle Kingdom pharaoh, virtually the only Egyptian pharaoh you can always recognize by his sculptures is Akhenaten, because he went for an extremely naturalistic look in all of his portraits. So he has a very long chin, very full lips, very high cheekbones, very distinctive looking fellow. And what he did, and this is historical fact, he smashed polytheism, all the polytheistic cults in Egypt, and tried to institute a worship of a single pseudo-monotheistic god called Aten. And obviously Aten has the same etymological base as the Hebrew word for God, Adon. The Bible in the Exodus story talks repeatedly not about leaving Egypt initially, but about the desire to go out into the desert and pray to God, to pray to their God, to the one God in their own fashion. And this is rejected by Pharaoh. Akhenaten was the Pharaoh, but he left the capital of Thebes, went out into the desert, and built a completely new city dedicated to the worship of Aten, where worship of the old gods was prohibited. And then he disappears completely. He is erased from Egyptian history, and not metaphorically, but literally, because after his death, this period of monotheism, the so-called Amarna heresy, was physically erased from lists of kings all over Egypt. Because, as I said before, the Egyptians loved keeping lists of things, but this was so heretical, this period of monotheism, that his successors, when they returned to polytheism, his son was Tutankhamun, and after he died very young, the kingship returned to polytheists, and they obliterated any mention of this period from all the contemporary Egyptian sources.
In which case, why do we know about it at all?
Well, because Amarna being built in the desert was very dry, and a lot of letters that were written at that time survived, the so-called Amarna letters, in which are hymns written by Akhenaten himself, which
Written
has
on what?
clay tablets.
And these were discovered just in the desert.
Yeah, basically. And they discuss the situation in the Near East. They discuss his religious philosophies. There is a poem he wrote called The Great Hymn of Aten, which bears a great similarity to one of the Psalms. I can't remember the number offhand, sorry. But there is in the Met one portrait of him that you can really see these very distinct features, the long chin, the full lips, the high cheekbones. And he's such a singular figure in history that he's worth just looking at and contemplating what his connection to the entire basis of Western civilization may be. And was he a basis for the Moses character who would be written about 500 or 1,000 years later? Was he an historical basis for the invention of monotheism that would become Judaism and then, of course, Christianity and Islam? The Exodus story was, of course, the basis for the American Republic in many ways. So are all modern republics essentially tracing themselves back to this desire by Akhenaten to leave Thebes and go out into the desert where he could worship as he saw fit.
And so where can we see this in the Met?
It's in the New Kingdom section, just before Dendur, after the Middle Kingdom section. You go through chronologically, so you start Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and Akhenaten's in the New Kingdom.
And it's a sculpture?
It's just a head. It's there are several sculptures of him, and there's some bas-relief portraits of him where you can also recognize him from the long chin, the full lips.
And is this just outside the Temple of Dendur room?
Right, yes. It's just before you get to Dendur, and it's unmissable.
All right, very good. I will take a look at that. And generally speaking, I zoomed through to the Temple of Dendur, and before you tell us about it historically, I'll just say that the reason that I go there is that it's an extremely striking place to be. There are a lot of rooms in the Met like this that have a very evocative feeling that's not a result of, well, I mean, in this case, it's largely the result of a single object, but, you know, they could have displayed this in any one of a large number of ways. The room that they built for it was the best possible solution. It has a lot of light coming from the outside during the day, but during the night, it has a lot of darkness, you might say. It's really striking to see it under both conditions, but the way they built it together with some reflecting pools, they gave it a very large enclosed space, which feels almost outside. This is very striking architecture by Roche Dinkeloo, which was the expansion of the original, or sort of the core Met. What you think of when you see the facade of the museum is the McKim-Eden white facade, but then when they expanded the Met on either side, Roche Dinkeloo did the designs for that, and that includes the Temple of Dendur area. So tell us about the temple itself.
It's an Egyptian temple, and it was sold to the United States because the government of Egypt was damming the Nile to create the Aswan High Dam, the Aswan Dam, and a lot of stuff in the Nile River Valley was going to be flooded, and so the United States the Met was able to buy this temple. Well,
there was a competition between the American museums, especially between the Washington, or rather the Smithsonian museums, and the Met. It was actually quite a political fight, which Thomas Hoving details in his book, his rather depressing book about the politics of being curator of the Met.
It's not the only thing that was moved from the Nile River Valley. If you've seen any movie about ancient Egypt or any movie set in Egypt ever, you've seen scenes at the Abu Simbel Temple, which is the temple with the 4 gigantic Ramses statues sitting in front of it. That's actually in a fake mountain because it was in the Nile River Valley and was going to be flooded. And it took huge international pressure on the Egyptian government to get them not to just flood it. And so the entire thing was moved and put into an artificial mountain on a nearby hilltop.
What do you mean an artificial mountain?
They built a fake mountain that sort of matched the original setting.
How can you build a fake mountain?
You pile up a lot of dirt.
So I thought it was a hill. I mean, they piled up dirt and they...
Yeah. And then to try to match the original setting as closely as possible, and then move the entire they moved the temple first and then built up the hill around it because it goes into the hillside. But one of the things that was moved was the Temple of Dendur. Now, the Temple of Dendur, it's an Egyptian temple in the sense that it was built in Egypt and has certain stylogical homages to ancient Egyptian temples.
It has hieroglyphs.
Yeah, but it was built by Augustus after he had already become Augustus, after Cleopatra was already dead. This was the reason that the month of August is called August is not just to celebrate Augustus, that is, who had been Octavian, who was the first emperor of Rome after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony in the final stages of the Roman Republican Civil War, August, he took personal possession of Egypt It didn't immediately become a Roman province. And basically, he made a deal with the Roman government that he would give Rome Egypt in exchange. He would become Augustus. And the month of August was named in his honor. And to celebrate his acquisition of Egypt, it was the 6 months of the year. This was when the year began in March.
Yeah, well, the year used to begin in March, and so originally this would have been Sextilis, that is the 6th month.
And it was renamed August to celebrate Augustus getting Egypt. And to sort of celebrate Egypt and his becoming essentially Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh after Cleopatra's death. Cleopatra's son Caesarion was technically Pharaoh for like a week until Augustus found him and killed him.
Seems kind of mean.
Yeah, well, Augustus was a real bastard. I mean, he was a very effective bureaucrat and administrator, but he was not a nice person, so far as I can tell. Though, that's true of so many Egyptian emperors, Egyptian emperors too, Roman emperors, is what I meant to say. But, so this is 1,000 years after Akhenaten. This was built in 31 BC. Wait, is that right? 10 BC. So it's very new. It's practically brand new. We're talking an entirely different period of Egyptian history. And this is because this is not just the border between Egypt and Roman Egypt, but we've already gone through 300 years of Greek Egypt. Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC, and this is the beginning of the period of Greek Egypt. When he died, his empire was divided up among his 4 senior generals. One of them was Ptolemy, and he got Egypt, and Cleopatra was his descendant. So she wasn't Egyptian, and her family had lived in Egypt for 300 years, but she was not culturally Egyptian or ethnically Egyptian. She was Greek. And pure Greek, because there was a lot of intermarriage in incestuous and disgusting ways. The Ptolemaic dynasty was really gross. I didn't like them. But the Temple of Dendur is not only after Egypt, but after Greek Egypt and at the beginning of Roman Egypt. So it's a Roman temple in an Egyptian style, a Roman temple built in imitation of Greek Egyptian style. So it's a very confused building architecturally, but it's still extremely interesting. And basically, when you look at this temple, it's not just a celebration of Egyptian culture. It's a celebration of the death of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, which ended the Civil War. And that was when Augustus had this temple and several others built.
So everyone was very delighted when Cleopatra died?
Yes, they were. They really were. And the reason for this is because the entire Mediterranean had been going through hundreds of years of constant warfare. And if you can say nothing else for Augustus, it's that he ruled the empire with a pretty iron grip. And after 100 years of Roman civil war, you had the Marion and Sulla, and then Caesar and Pompey, and then Mark Antony and Augustus and Brutus and Cassius, and then later Mark Antony versus Augustus. After all of these civil wars, finally there was a period of peace, and that was marked by Mark Antony and Cleopatra finally dying. So everyone was actually pretty excited by that. And that was when the Temple of Dendur was built. So when you look at it, what you're seeing is the marking of the end of old history, the beginning of new history. It's very close to it's 10 years before AD started, 10 years before the birth of Christ, the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. So it's really the marking of the two most important epochs in our dating of history, which is Roman Republic and Roman Empire, and before Christ and after Christ. So in addition to being a very pretty object and a very interesting room, it is of a great chronological significance.
Now that I know the history a bit more, I will certainly look at it with new eyes. At the same rate, it's one of these places that one can really, I think you can really enjoy just by the atmosphere there. Even though it is not ancient Egyptian, it's a lot more ancient than any buildings we're likely to encounter on Fifth Avenue otherwise. And so it's a very interesting experience.
Yes, but when you look at this, and it has columns that are quite similar to the Palm Column of the Old Kingdom period, the Temple of Dendur is not only closer to us than the Palm Column is, it's 500 years closer to us than the Palm Column is. The Palm Column is unbelievably ancient, and in relative terms, the Temple of Dendur is really quite new, despite being 2,000 years old, 2,036 years old.
This is also one of those rooms which it's worth seeing late at night, and Friday and Saturday.
It's a great date room.
Friday and Saturday, the Met is open late. It used to be one of the worst things. Now, this is going to sound wrong. One of the worst things that happened during COVID is that the Met stopped being open every day of the week. Of course, for most of the Mets history, it was traditionally closed on at least one day of the week. I think it was Monday, and that was kind of a drag because I always like to be able to walk into the museum. Then the only good thing to happen while I was living in New York City for a decade was that the Met went to being open 7 days a week, and that was a tremendous revolution. Then, of course, COVID happened a couple of years afterwards, and they shut down completely. When they reopened, they were simply too lazy to return to their pre-COVID schedule. It's not as though, so now they're closed on Wednesdays. It's not as though no one wants to see the Met on Wednesday, but it's closed again. It is open late on Friday and Saturday until 9 p.m. And generally speaking, of course, there are fewer people around at that time. And this gives you the chance to visit some areas that are normally just overrun. It also gives you a chance to visit some rooms that are normally reasonably quiet and you can have completely to yourself. And this is something that I want to cover at some point. Since the question of enjoying the Met from an architectural and also an historical perspective, as you've been discussing, it's a little bit different than enjoying it from a strictly artistic perspective. But being in these rooms surrounded by many art objects at once gives you a very interesting feeling, and it can immerse you completely in different epochs of history or culture. And so there are a number of rooms I have on this list that, depending on the time of day, you can go to be almost alone and really bask in whatever that particular environment is. The Temple of Dendur is one of them, and we should remember to get back to the others. But the ones off the top of my head that are particularly striking as in the American Wing courtyard, that also can be quite empty late at night, and it has a great St. Gaudens sculpture, and it has the facade of a 19th century American house that was moved into the Met essentially, so you can see what it looks like entire. That's a very striking place to be. There are also some places in the Asian Wing and the Greek Wing also. We'll get to those, but perhaps I'll just mark them out when on our tour we arrive at one of these places where the room itself has a great deal of atmosphere. And if you see it at the right time on the right day, you will get a tremendous kick out of it. That is more than the sum of the artworks that are there. I think that's the case with the Temple of Dendur room.
Absolutely. Do you want to discuss the history of the Met at all before we move on to Greece?
Yes. Do you know any of the history of the Met?
Not really.
Okay,
I think it was founded in 1870. I sort of assumed you were going to do this.
No, I have read about the history of the Met. Of course, it used to be in a different building, and then it was relocated here. And McKim Mead and White designed the facade around 1910, early 20th century building, and it has expanded ever since. Again, Roche Dinklou did the wings on either side, and then the Lehman wing, which was the most recent addition, is sort of in the back. That is the collection of a single man who insisted that his art all be kept together. The result is actually quite interesting. For one thing, it forces them to keep the collection on display, which has many extremely striking and important pieces, and we'll cover that as sort of part of our museum tour. And the architecture is also interesting. It's not really a complete success, I would say, architecturally speaking, compared to the rest of the museum. But they often put on interesting shows there. They have many interesting pieces in their permanent collection, and we'll get there. I don't think that we need to do more of the history of the museum, but one thing that I would like to say is that we should take a moment to thank everyone who has listened this far and who has been listening to the podcast and perhaps watching our content on YouTube or on Instagram. We are really blown away by the response, which was much more than we ever expected. I think almost 3 million people have watched our things on YouTube in the last month, 2 million people on Instagram. It's really striking, and we're very grateful. So thank you for listening.
We are very, very grateful. A couple days ago, we passed 50,000 combined subscribers. Which was we've only been doing this for a couple of months, so that was pretty surprising, and we really do greatly appreciate all of the support from everyone. And we do try to read and respond to as many comments as possible. There are, frankly, a lot more comments than we were expecting, but we have gone through all of them.
Yes, I will say that we read almost all of them and we respond where we can. And so if you're listening, if you've listened this far into the podcast, you're one of these people. We are very grateful for your listens. Please continue to listen to us and leave comments and send us suggestions. We are happy to delve into whatever subjects you find interesting.
Definitely.
All right, let's carry on. So you've got us all the way back to Egypt. Now, usually when I see the Temple of Dendur room, I actually am coming down from upstairs, which is the Asian galleries. And there's a nice staircase that goes down and debouches right into the Temple of Dendur area. But I take it that you would have us go back across the main rotunda and to the Greek side.
from Dendur, you're going back through history all the way back to that palm column, which I keep talking about, and then going across the lobby into the Greek section.
So we're walking from north to south. When you are in the Temple of Dendur room, you're in the northernmost point of the Met Museum, up and down Fifth Avenue. And so if you walk south, you're retracing your steps now, which I think is a rather odd way to go about it. I like to perambulate in a circular manner, but nonetheless, for the sake of argument, we're walking south back through the entrance point, the main hallway, which is this really nice open atrium, again by McKim, Mead, and White. And you continue to walk south, and then you'll end up in the Greek galleries.
Right, and I just want, while it's fresh in your mind, compare the Egyptian column that's 4.5 millennia old to the Temple of Artemis column, an Ionic column, a Greek column, that's only 2.5 millennia old. 2 millennia newer, performing basically the same function. It's a very striking comparison.
And this Temple of Artemis column you have to walk all the way
Sardis.
through. Well, I was going to say where it is in the museum. Geographically, you have to walk, again, south. You enter the Greek galleries, which are a nice, long, covered by sort of an arched ceiling. If you walk all the way through this long gallery, which has openings on either side, which will take you to ancient Greece and pre-Greece. But if you get to the end of that gallery to an area which has staircases and elevators, right before then you'll see this column.
Yeah, and it's about 150 years newer than the Parthenon, which is a Doric temple. And this is an Ionic column. That is a column with the distinctive scrolls at the top. But it's a very interesting counterpoint. And again, something that is just about halfway in history between the palm column and us today. So you're looking at something very ancient and yet something that's quite new in the larger scheme of history.
Fair enough. Now, is there anything in terms of the art here that you specifically wanted to see? Because this is the beginning of where I might stop off on the first floor before walking upstairs to take a look at some of the Greek art, or one piece in particular.
There's a chorus, which is from the oldest period of Greek art that we think of as being Greek art. Even though it's still about 200 years newer than Homer, it's about 600 BC or BC. It's got really not a very Greek look when you picture Greek stuff. It's got long braided hair, but this is the signature style of Greece from the period that preceded classical Greece, which is generally what you think of when you think of Greece. And it's much less naturalistic than classical Greek sculpture, but it's just a good thing to sort of palate cleanse yourself before you get into the classical
Is it
Greek sculpture
Etruscan?
stuff. No. Etruscan. The Etruscans are northern Italians, and they have to do with Rome, not with Greece.
But don't you go through an Etruscan area before you get to ancient Greece if you're walking from the rotunda?
Yeah, but I'm not really that into Etruscan stuff. We'll talk about the chariot, though. I mean, the Etruscans are interesting and perhaps were Greeks themselves at one point. They may have been founded as a Lydian colony from the west coast of Anatolia, which used to be Greece. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not they were Greek settlers or if they were native North Italians. Basically, the Etruscan city-states roughly corresponded to modern Tuscany. And there's been a lot of interesting archaeology there. The Etruscan language has actually never been fully translated. So even though there's a lot of Etruscan writing around, it's not really comprehensible in the same way ancient Greek writing is or ancient Latin writing. And maybe that's why it's always been somewhat less interesting to me. Also, there are no great Etruscan poets who form part of the Western canon the way Homer or Ovid or Virgil do. So it's never really been my thing. But the Etruscan chariot, maybe we should go straight to the Etruscan chariot.
No, we shouldn't, because the Etruscan chariot is on the second floor. Before we go upstairs, though, we should talk about what there is to see on the first floor. You're going to talk about something from an historical perspective. After you do, I'm going to talk about the first thing that we can talk about from an artistic perspective. So,
okay. Well, unless you count that very interesting Sphinx portrait. But after you look at the Kouros, which is archaic Greece, then you move into classical Greece, and you look at the bronze discus thrower, and you can see there's a huge leap forward in naturalism. It's sort of a Renaissance-type breakthrough in art and in civilization generally. And then you have a lot of Greek sculptures which exist now only as Roman copies, but it gives you an idea of the enormous influence of Greek art on the entire world and the tremendous breakthroughs that have been made in the naturalism of human depictions versus the very rigid and upright Egyptian and archaic Greek sculptures. Is this where you want to jump in with some art history?
This is Generally speaking, the oldest thing in the Met that I will look at and enjoy from a purely artistic perspective are the Greek vases. And there are some extremely good ones in the galleries that if you're walking south from the main area, if you're walking south from the atrium and you go through the long gallery, you can turn right and there's some galleries that are full of vases, and some of them are extremely distinguished and very beautiful. And they also showcase the remarkable draftsmanship of ancient Greek artists. And again, although they're not naturalistic per se, they have really tremendously lyrical lines. They're extremely beautiful from a drawing perspective. And if you think that the figures on ancient Greek vases look too stylized or too cartoonish or something, you should sit down and try drawing these yourselves, and you'll see just how difficult it is. It reminds me actually of, I remember a story from, I think actually it was in a de Kooning biography, and this has nothing to do with art actually, it has to do with dance, but they were looking at pictures of a great ballet virtuoso, I think it was Balanchine, and they thought that these photographs looked pretty easy, so they tried to get themselves into the poses that Balanchine was holding for the photographs, and they couldn't. And so that's the thing, is that some of the art looks deceptively simple, but is actually really it would be beyond any ordinary person to create. It's really
like Ringo's drumming.
Yeah, that's probably a good analogy. Ringo seems to be holding a very simple beat, but if you try to do it yourself, it turns out to be very difficult. These vases are worth looking at, and they come really in two distinct historical periods. The older vases are the black figures, so-called, which have red backgrounds, and the people on them are in black because it was easier. Because the natural color of the vases is that sort of earthenware color, and so when people painted on them, they painted the figures in black paint. Later, the artists figured out how to make things more natural looking by, instead of painting in the figures, they would paint in the backgrounds. And so you got red figure vases, which are the more modern of the two. And that's the area where I think the most distinguished artist who we've identified resides. Around 490 BC, the vases of the so-called Berlin painter, he's named, obviously he wasn't resident in Berlin, but the vase that gave him his name is in a Berlin collection, which I think is in the Pergamon now. I'm not actually sure, but there are several really distinguished pieces by the Berlin painter. They'll say attributed to, but the fact is that his style was so distinct that we know that he created these vases. And you can go and take a look at them. They're all adjacent to each other in this gallery. One of my favorite is it's a jar, a so-called stamnos, sort of a big, I suppose a big wine jug jar type thing, which has some gods, Athena and Zeus and Hera on one side, and then just some drinking fellows on the other. But the characters, and so again, this is a red figure, a slightly later vase. The draftsmanship is just so extraordinarily lyrical, and you don't even have to put yourself in mind of when this was created. You can really just enjoy the quality, the remarkable, graceful quality of the drawing, and let it just flow around you. Very few people bother to actually come and look at these galleries and appreciate the vases. And I admit, actually, that generally speaking, because it's so distant from us and our modern artistic culture, that it seems a little bit harder, I think, to appreciate on the surface. I just think you should give yourself a chance to stand in front of some of these vases. Go look for the Berlin painter, identify his pieces in the museum, and stand in front of them for a few minutes, and you will be struck by how beautiful they are in a seemingly simple but very difficult to recreate way. If you look at the detail that he does in the sort of the edging of their garments and so forth, and there's sort of the additional decorational motif, he must have had an extremely steady hand because the lines are all so fine. It's just something that I really enjoy looking at. If you're looking for a place where you can really connect with the, I guess, a more reflective mood of the Met, this would be a good choice, I think.
I agree. And another way to get into a very reflective mood is in the adjacent galleries with the Roman portrait busts. It's not quite chronological, but since we're talking about this, there's something about
it
looking...
makes more sense to do this geographically.
Yeah. No, I'm not talking about geographically either. I'm just talking about emotionally. There's something about looking into the faces of 2,000-year-old people, and because it's silly to call it photorealistic, but the astonishing perfection in every wrinkle and crease and imperfection of real people's faces from 2,000 years ago, and in a one-to-one human-sized scale, and you just stand in front of them as if you're having a conversation. It is a remarkable feeling that is very hard to duplicate with anything else.
That's absolutely true. And there's some very good portrait busts on that lower level as well. and around a nice sort of fountain in the courtyard. So if you go all the way to the south, there's that nice enclosed courtyard area. You can see second floor balcony, and that is actually where your Etruscan chariot is. You have to go up the stairs. You can take an elevator. I prefer going up the stairs because it's completely out of the way. Because these galleries that wrap around on this sort of intermediate floor don't lead anywhere. And so you actually have to go to them, and you sort of choose to get off the staircase, as it were, before you've gotten to the top. Not very many people take the staircase. Not many people go to these galleries. As a result, this is another great place to be. Even when the museum is busy, that won't be completely overrun. It contains a lot more vases, a lot of Roman glassware, which is extremely interesting. You know, the delicacy of their glass. We think of Romans and Greeks more for pottery. The fact is that they did a lot of glass, and obviously glass was very fragile, and most of it broke. But when you see ancient Roman glass, which has an extraordinarily, not only extraordinarily delicate, but the quality of the colors, it's really a type of glass that I don't think we can make anymore. There's a quality of translucence as opposed to sort of the transparency of modern glass. I think there are more impurities in the glass. So
making truly transparent, colorless glass is an art that wouldn't be developed for another.
Yes, and I think it's somewhat a shame that we got so good at transparent, colorless glass, and that became the default, because this glass does have imperfections, impurities in it that give it a remarkable depth, somewhat of a smokiness. There are great colors and even textures in this glass, and the delicacy, the thinness of the material is also absolutely extraordinary. These are more cases of things that people just walk by without even a second glance, but they are really worth looking at. They're really rather beautiful, and it's extraordinary to think that any of them survived when you see how delicate they are.
Well, yeah, and of course a lot of them are sort of mosaics that have been reassembled like jigsaw puzzles, but there are some that are in very good condition and definitely worth looking at. I do love a bit of colored glass.
Yes, and so you see those largely at the end of this relatively non-traveled gallery, and it's sort of, the gallery is in an L shape. If you go to the end of it and then turn right, you end up with a balcony which has a very nice view overlooking the Greek courtyard and the Greek and Roman courtyard, I guess, with all the portraiture bust below. But then you have your Etruscan chariot, the Monteleone chariot.
Yes, so the Monteleone chariot, there's been considerable debate about whether it was a ceremonial chariot or actually a combat chariot. I think the current thinking is leaning towards an actual combat chariot, or else it was driven by a drunk charioteer who took it off the road because it was in a bad crash at some point. Apparently, you can still see this in the suspension. I'd never noticed, but it's been dated to the 6th century BC, 530 BC, and it depicts scenes from the Iliad. Depict scenes from Achilles' life.
So to put this into context, this is similar, or not exactly contemporary, but a little bit earlier than the Berlin Painter vase.
Yeah, so it's about 50 years before the Berlin Painter, about 100 years before the Parthenon, 500 years before the Temple of Dendur, so considerably older. It's Etruscan. It's got Greek decorations on it, which sort of supports the Greek. Etruscan. Yeah. Well, most of Italy was settled by Greeks at one point or another, specifically in Sicily, but also in the heel of Italy and further north in what is now Tuscany, in Etruscan territory. This was discovered in Umbria by a farmer who was trying to dig a wine cellar. In any event, that's the point I wanted to make before talking about the rest of the chariot, is just that in depicting scenes from the story of Achilles, even though Achilles existed separately as a fictional character, separately from Homer's work. This is about 300 years after Homer was telling, as a bard, the story of the Iliad. It's just very interesting that this had spread so widely across the world. The Achilles story, the Homer story, and his relation, whoever made this chariot, his relation to Homer was roughly our relation to the writers of the Declaration of Independence, in about 250 years difference.
Practically the other day. And
right. So he was already a figure of history, but not of ancient history.
The reason I find it interesting is just because it's one of the largest, when you talk about corruptible versus incorruptible objects, things made of wood generally rot depending on where they're kept and so forth. It's one of the largest, most complex objects to survive more or less intact from the era, and it's really interesting to look at. You also observe that their horses must have been relatively small, because the level of the collars, if you tried to put this on modern horses, they would just tip whoever was in the chariot right at the back. So,
yes, if I read a very interesting book about medieval France some years ago, and it remarked in passing that if Julius Caesar had shown up in medieval France, the thing that surprised him most wouldn't have been the Gothic cathedrals or the plate armor or the steel. It would have been the size of the horses. Because selective breeding of horses, sort of like selective breeding of dogs, had created a breed of horses that were much, much larger than ancient Roman or Greek horses. And you can really see that.
So
here
were
from the
the
size of
ancient
the
Roman
glass.
horses the size of ponies then? Yes.
Yeah, pretty much.
It,
That's how it appears. Which is probably why they could ride them without stirrups, which weren't discovered until considerably later. Weren't invented until considerably later.
And that does make sense. And so you can look across the top of this chariot out into the courtyard below, sort of from the balcony, and it's a nice place to be. Generally speaking, though, this is sort of just my beginning of the tour of the Met. So I would have.
Yeah, well, I often start there too, because when I drive into the city and I park at the Met, this is right above the parking garage entrance.
Yes.
So it's a convenient place to start.
That is a handy entrance, by the way.
Yeah. The way chariots work, by the way, war chariots, it seems natural to assume that they come after mounted cavalry, but they were actually an older technology than mounted cavalry, just because horsemanship, one man riding a horse firing a bow and arrow, is a more complicated operation than chariots, because chariots are two-man operations. You have a driver and a shooter. And even though it seems like it would be a very tight fit, basically you would have the shooter standing behind the driver, maybe with an arm around his waist while they're driving fast, and holding on to a bit of railing, with quivers probably mounted at all four corners of the chariot platform so he could shoot front left and front right and back right. And that's what a chariot was for. It was an artillery platform to bring an archer close into to infantry positions and then evacuate him quickly if necessary. It was also a good way for officers to get around the battlefield quickly. That is, an officer standing behind his driver. And this is talked about repeatedly in the Iliad.
It had not occurred to me, even though I have read the Iliad, that you could fit two people in one of these chariots, because they do look incredibly tiny.
Well, Hector, the Iliad is always talking about Hector and his driver riding around the battlefield, and also for the Greek heroes. That is, I think his driver is shot and then someone else has to drive the chariot, things like that.
Imagine being a driver is a pretty shoddy and dangerous position, because after all, you're standing at the front, so...
Yeah, well, you've got the armor of the front part of the chariot. I mean, that's not really necessary to the function of the chariot. All you need is a platform to stand on and maybe something to hold on to. But the sort of shield in front of the lower half of the body of the driver is there to protect him from incoming arrow
Still,
fire.
this is not a job I would have cared for.
No, and I'm sure it took a remarkable amount of skill to navigate a chariot, a two-wheeled chariot, which was, of course, a big innovation over four-wheeled chariots, which were a lot heavier and slower.
I don't think I've ever seen a four-wheeled chariot.
I don't think any survived, but you can.
Well,
they look like ox carts.
Supposedly, what was used in the Homeric poems, were they referring
two-wheeled
to
chariots? This is basically exactly what's being talked about in the Iliad, even though it's a few hundred years later, a few hundred years after it was written. The Trojan War was like 700 or 800 years.
Yeah, so
older than this chariot.
the Iliad is historical fiction. It's writing about a considerably earlier epoch. So
yes, certainly.
But does it write about it in modern context? I think
goes back and forth.
Homer uses details of warfare that wouldn't have existed until his day. That would have been historically
but
inaccurate.
Simultaneously, he uses details of war that did not exist in his day and were known to have come from much earlier Bronze Age Greece.
So it's a semi-historical portrait, not completely accurate.
Well, like all historical fiction, it's they're anachronisms, but they're also very important nuggets of real history that survive only in Homer, that give us an idea of a much older period of Attic Greece and Anatolian Hittite culture, which is what the Trojans were. In any event, so you have this chariot. It would have had two men on it, one driving, one firing arrows, and I think this is the only ancient Greek, even though it was found in Tuscany, ancient Greek chariot of this sort to survive all in one piece. It's virtually completely original. And it's a remarkable piece because it takes you back in history to so many great events in history. And it's a very elegant design. And it has very beautiful bronze flourishes on its side, showing Achilles fighting Memnon, showing Achilles getting his new armor from his mother Thetis. after I think Hector has stolen, well, that has taken as a trophy his armor after
Well, so
Patroclus was wearing his armor and
that
was
raises
killed.
the question: did this story of Achilles become a big hit because of Homer, or was it a big hit that Homer then cashed in on? That is, were these stories generally known?
Well, there are other versions of the stories in other poems from the period, the so-called Little Iliad, and part of the epic cycle of poems that used to be considered to be written by Homer. Now it's only thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey are part of the official Homeric canon, even though there's some dispute about that too.
Was there supposed to be
The,
a third poem that he'd written?
no, I think there were five in total, part of the so-called epic cycle. And the other ones are very interesting, and they fill in a lot of the details that don't exist in the Iliad or the Odyssey, stuff like the Trojan horse. Of course, that comes a lot from the Aeneid too. But this gives you just a very good idea of the very end of the archaic period of Greece, just before the classical period really gets going. So about 50 years, as we said, before the Parthenon, which is sort of peak classical Greece, or peak early classical Greece, I should say. But really what it is just it's a beautiful object. It's a beautiful thing to look at, completely separate from its being a remarkable feat of engineering that's so old and a remarkable look into history.
I would describe it as rather more intriguing than beautiful per se. I'm not sure that I regard it as beautiful, but I do think it's extremely fascinating to stand next to it. The one thing that I think of as particularly beautiful is the sort of the quality of the patina, because properly...
Yeah, the verdigris.
Yes, patinated bronze, that is... Bronze rusts also, but it doesn't rust. It rusts into this wonderful verdigris color. And so the shift of color from bronze's natural sort of dull goldish hue through deep black and then finally into this green, that's a wonderful progression of colors, and you can see all of them on this chariot.
And if you've just come upstairs from looking at, among other things, the archaic Koro statue, you can see that there's a bronze figure on this chariot who is almost identical, because the archaic style was very distinctive and didn't allow for a lot of variation. And so you can really see that style surviving in this bronze. And yes, a lot of the beauty comes from the verdigris patina, but the bas-relief sculptures themselves are very interesting.
I have to say that one of the areas that I didn't used to visit, well, I mean, it didn't used to exist, it's relatively newer, is the Islamic wing. And there are just some really nice things there. It used to be that what I would do is I'd stop off at this gallery, I'd go to the top of the stairs, and then I'd go to 19th century European painting. However, you can stop off now before you get there in the Islamic wing, which has some extremely distinctive spaces in it. And so just in terms of a lot of their design, especially their mosaic design, the architecture, is extremely beautiful. There's a rhythm to their decorative motifs that is completely different from, Celtic or Anglo-Saxon decorative motif. And I don't prefer one to the other per se, but in their situations, they are extremely fitting and beautiful. And so if you wander into the Islamic wing, we are continuing upstairs now, you will find this little room, which was, it's a Syrian room, apparently, from around 1700, and they moved the room entire into the museum. And you can't quite walk into it, but you can sort of stand in the doorway, and there's a little fountain in the doorway. And it's lined on the outside with very low cushions where one could have sat and presumably had a chat with the other people in the room. It's an extremely evocative space with the light simulated as coming from the outside. There's some very nice stained glass windows on the upper level. This is a very evocative space, and it's intriguing because it's so different from the spaces that you are likely to encounter on a regular basis here. The mosaic tile work and just the feeling of the room overall. And this is actually another place, one of these places where if you hit it at the right moment, especially if you go to the museum on one of its after hours moments, you're likely to be able to stand here by yourself and just take in this space. Very thoughtful, very reflective. And it's become one of my favorite places in the museum. And a reminder that rooms themselves are artworks treated properly. Architecture, of course, is one of the most important arts. It's rarely considered properly as such. This is a wonderful little room. Everything in it works extremely well. The design, the features, it's worth standing in, taking it all in. And if you proceed through the Islamic wing, there are other very striking areas. There's also a little courtyard with a fountain in it. There are no particular pieces that stand out to me as much, although there are some very bright turquoise hues that they use in their pigments, somewhat reminiscent of the Egyptian hippopotamus. Yeah, the turquoise hippopotamus. That brilliant, bright turquoise glaze, which exists in some of the pottery here, is also very beautiful and worth seeing. But and then they have some very striking, extremely gigantic carpets. I enjoy this area because of it's rare to find something that has been done recently in museum curatorship that I think is an improvement. Generally speaking, when curators make changes, they make things worse. And generally speaking, new installations are worse than whatever used to be there. This is one exception. I certainly wasn't expecting it, but I really like the way they've done the Islamic art galleries. And so if you're going to see one thing in there, I say find that reception room, the Syrian reception room that they've just shoved into essentially a corner. You'll have to look around for it a bit, but when you find it, you'll know it, and it's a very striking place to be. And so now, instead of passing straight through to European painting, which is where we would go to next, I stop off at the Islamic wing, I take a look at this room. If necessary, I wait for the other people to leave so I can be there by myself, because it's a great place for reflection.
A very good approach. And there's a similar place, even though it's not in the same part of the museum. There's a similar sort of courtyard room in the East Asian section.
There is, and the Japanese galleries, which we will get to. That may be, just from a sitting around perspective, my favorite place in the museum. It's certainly close, and I think that we should say European painting. We're about to launch on painting, but let's do that in the subsequent episode. And
well, I think before we get to European painting, and we've already jumped ahead so far in time, we should probably touch on Arms and Armor, which chronologically come before European painting. The European paintings of the Met. Anyway.
I don't think we should, because it's just all the way across the museum. And again, you cannot go through the museum in a strictly chronological order. You're just going to have to run back and forth so much. It doesn't make sense.
God forbid you should run back and forth in the Met, seeing all the interesting minor things you might have missed.
Well, you're not going to just close your eyes and walk through another gallery, European painting, go downstairs the main staircase,
I'm not suggesting
walk through medieval art. Well, how the hell are you supposed to get there?
Don't walk through the Met with your eyes closed. That would be a foolish decision and dangerous.
We are now upstairs in the Islamic art wing, or say we're even going to stay in the Greek level. If you want to go through to Arms and Armor, which is chronologically the next, you're going to have to go downstairs, back through the end of the Greek room, back to the rotunda, and walk straight back. That is west. Why would you do that? That is just, it doesn't make any sense. You will walk by it if you go through European painting first.
This is why you have no clear picture of all of history.
And this is why you have no clear picture of aesthetics, because you don't even, I don't think you even go through the Met in an honest aesthetic progression of one beautiful object to the next beautiful object. That's the only reasonable way to see it.
So you think I actually go through the Met with my eyes closed to get from the Egyptian wing to the...
No, but I don't believe that you would. I don't believe you would go to see this chariot and then immediately rush off to Arms and Armor either. You don't have to see things in a purely chronological progression. And besides,
no. And when I go to the Met, I don't look at everything. I've never done a complete Met tour during one Met thing. When I go one Met trip, when I go to the Met, there's something I want to look at, and I go and look at it.
Well,
but we're doing the whole Met.
We are doing the whole Met, but I have a progression through the whole Met, and it doesn't start by going to medieval Arms and Armor. The idea, in my view, is to give people a sense of how they can walk through the Met and what they should see on their way. There is a beautiful and sensible progression that will show you a variety of different things, not strictly from a chronological perspective, but actually very aesthetically harmonious. That's my favorite thing about the Met, is how they juxtapose these different galleries. And if you do everything chronologically, well, you're just wrecking its best feature. I would say, let's cut it there and begin next time with European painting, which is where I would go after the Islamic wing. And before we sign off, I'd just like to say a little bit about what we have in mind for the Museum of Everything, because people have asked us, is it a real museum? Is this just the name of your channel? We are actually a 501c3. We have tax-exempt status, so we can accept donations of objects for the museum. And the idea is to create a real physical museum in southern Florida that follows along the lines of what we would think of as the ideal museum. This is, some kids want to be firemen or police officers or soldiers or whatever the case may be. We want to be museum curators. Now, that may sound a little bit peculiar.
Those other things too, but we also wanted to be museum curators.
I always wanted to be a curator. When I was little, I had set up my bedroom like a museum, and I made tags for the different things, little explanatory cards about what I had on display, because we have always found objects to be extremely interesting. All museums really have this self-imposed limitation of being about a particular subject. So the art museums have art, or maybe they only have a type of art like modern art. And then you have a history museum for historical objects, and you may have an industrial design museum or a science museum. we like the idea of creating fascinating tableaux that span all of these areas, because there's no reason you shouldn't have a beautiful painting next to a beautiful car. The idea that we have is to collect as many interesting objects as possible across a wide variety of subjects, as wide a variety of subjects as possible, and show you how they look together, show you interesting assemblages of objects that have never been seen before in the same place. And that's something that museums today just haven't been willing to do. There was one near exception, and I think the closest thing to what we're patenting our own museum after would be the American History Museum in Washington, D.C., as it used to be, before it was redone about 10 years ago and completely destroyed. In one of the worst artistic crimes of modern times, they took the most fascinating space, which had everything from a wall of Catalan radios to a drugstore counter and cars and Americana. They smashed it up. I really dislike what they've done to the museum, but the way it used to be is sort of the way we're thinking of this. And we are currently looking for the right space for it. So we're going to work with one of the local municipalities here, probably in Miami-Dade, and get some space donated to us for the museum where we can display these objects. In the meantime, we're still working on collecting the objects for the collection. So this involves us going out and finding interesting pieces that we would like to have on display eventually. And if you have anything interesting that you'd like us to take a look at or talk about on the podcast or in our content on YouTube, Instagram, please do get in touch with us and let us know.
Yeah, basically, we started doing the podcast and the content on Instagram and YouTube just to sort of get the word out about the museum.
To build awareness, because the idea is to make it ultimately the most interesting museum in the world. What we have in mind is a playground for the imagination. And so thanks again for listening, and please catch us on the next episode where we will be continuing our tour through the Met Museum of Art.
Yeah, and in the meantime, check out all of our stuff on YouTube and Instagram. Bye-bye.